The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the world into a fever dream. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the skeletal sagebrush, the splintered planks of the supply post, and the girl huddled beside the road. It settled in the folds of her worn calico dress, clung to the damp strands of her hair that had escaped their braid, and filled her throat with every shallow breath. This was the edge of nowhere, a place called Silver Bluff. Though there was nothing silver about it, it was a study, in browns and grays, a blister on the vast, indifferent skin of the territory. Her name was Marla, and she was 19 years old, a fact that felt both impossibly young and anciently old. She had been left here, or rather, she had made it here before her legs gave out. The wagon that had carried her, a rattling cage of misery, had rumbled on without a backward glance. The man who had driven it, a man whose name she refused to let form in her mind, had made his displeasure clear with the back of his hand before casting her out. A transaction he had made in a smoky saloon, a debt settled with her freedom, had ended here, in the dust. She pressed a hand to her cheek, the skin beneath her fingers tender and swollen. A deep, ugly bruise was blooming there, a violent flower of purple and blue. It throbbed in time with the pounding sun. Every part of her ached. Her feet were raw from stumbling over rock and scrub after she had fled. Her muscles screamed from a tension that had been her constant companion for weeks. And a deeper ache, one seated in her very soul, had left her hollow. She had curled into a small ball, trying to make herself disappear, to shrink away from the vast, empty sky that offered no shade and no comfort. She had no water, no food, and no destination. There was only the road, stretching in two directions toward the same horizon, and the crushing weight of hopelessness. For a time, there was nothing, only the buzz of a persistent fly and the whisper of the hot wind. The silence was so profound it was like a sound itself, a low hum that vibrated in her bones. She closed her eyes, the grit on her eyelids scratching with the movement. Maybe this was it. Maybe she would just lie here until she became part of the dust. Another forgotten story swallowed by the land. It was a strangely peaceful thought, a final letting go. Then, a new sound intruded. It was slow, rhythmic, and heavy, the plodding hoofbeats of a single horse. Marla's eyes snapped open. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through her, overriding the exhaustion. She tried to scramble further away from the road, to hide behind a sagebrush that offered no real cover. Her body protested, clumsy and weak. The horse was closer now. It was not moving with any urgency, just a steady, deliberate walk. She could hear the creak of saddle leather, the soft jingle of a bit. She held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The horse stopped. She risked a glance, peering through the tangled mess of her hair. It was a big roan, its coat the color of the dusty earth, its head low, and on its back sat a man. He was tall in the saddle, his shape a dark silhouette against the blinding sky. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, making it impossible to see his features. He didn't move. He just sat there, looking down at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Marla's fear began to curdle into a tense confusion. Men like the one she'd escaped were quick to act, their intentions brutal and clear. This man's stillness was unnerving. It was the stillness of a predator, perhaps, but a patient one. She watched his hands, resting easy on the saddle horn. They were gloved, the leather worn and dark. They did not move toward a whip or a rope or a gun. They just rested. Minutes passed. The sun beat down. The horse shifted its weight, snorting softly. The man remained a statue. He was simply watching her, as if she were a curious part of the landscape, a fallen rock or a strange, twisted tree. His quiet observation was more unsettling than a shout would have been. He was assessing her. She realized, But she couldn't guess the criteria. He was taking in the torn dress, the bruised face, the way she was coiled like a frightened animal. She expected to see disgust, or perhaps a cruel flicker of interest. Finally, he moved, not with speed, but with a slow, fluid grace. He swung a long leg over the saddle and dismounted. His boots landed in the dust with a soft thud. He stood to his full height, and he was taller than she had thought. Lean, but broad in the shoulders. He wore denim worn pale with sun and work, and a simple cotton shirt. He walked toward her, his steps measured, unhurried. He did not make the mistake of approaching too quickly. He stopped a few feet away, leaving a space of hot, dusty air between them. Now she could see his face, or at least more of it. It was a hard face, carved by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes and mouth, lines that spoke of long days and few comforts. His jaw was firm, covered in a dark stubble, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were as cold and steady as iron. Yet, as she stared into them, searching for the familiar glint of cruelty she had come to expect from all men, she found it absent. There was no malice there, no pity either. There was just a flat, unreadable calm. It was an unnerving neutrality. He looked at her, truly looked, and seemed to see everything, but he offered no judgment in return. His name was Calder Boone, though she did not know that. He had been riding back from the far pastures, checking the wells, a task he performed with the same silent, methodical patience he was displaying now. He had seen the small, crumpled shape on the side of the road from a distance and had assumed it was a dead coyote or a bundle of discarded rags. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a person, a woman, and the tension in his shoulders had tightened. Trouble came in many forms in this land, and a woman alone and beaten was one of its most potent. His first instinct, honed by years of solitude and loss, was to ride on. It was not his concern. The world was full of sorrows, and he had a full measure of his own. But he had stopped. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way she was curled up, a gesture of such profound defeat it pricked at something buried deep inside him. Or perhaps it was just that his father had raised him to believe that you didn't leave a creature to die in the sun, whether it was a stray calf or a person. So he had stopped, and he had watched, letting the silence do the work, letting her see that he meant no immediate harm. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she flinched as he dismounted. He saw the ugly bruise on her face, the raw scrapes on her arms. He saw the exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind that came after the fear had burned itself out. He saw all of this and he said nothing. Words were clumsy things, often useless. They could be twisted into lies or empty promises. Actions were cleaner, and action was what it was. After what felt like an eternity, he bent at the waist, a slight, slow inclination of his body, and he held out his hand. It was just there, suspended in the air between them, a large hand, the glove worn smooth over the knuckles. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was not a gesture of charity. It was a practical thing, an offer of leverage, a way up. It was an invitation without a single word attached. It asked for nothing, and it promised nothing, except for the simple mechanics of rising from the dust. Marla stared at that hand. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic and despair, suddenly went still. A man's hand. The last one to touch her had been hard and fast and full of rage. Before that, another hand had pushed her into a wagon, sealing a bargain she had no say in. Hands had been the source of all her pain, instruments of control. She recoiled from this one instinctively, a lifetime of lessons screaming at her to stay down, to not trust it. But her eyes flickered back to his face, to those cold, steady eyes. They did not change. There was no impatience in them, no command. He just waited. His gaze was as fixed and unwavering as the horizon. He was not ordering her. He was not even asking. He was simply Offering. The choice was hers. This was a new and terrifying concept. The sun beat on her back. The dust was hot beneath her. The ache in her body was a leaden weight. She could stay here. She could let the sun and the thirst take her. It would be an end. Or she could take that hand. She had no idea where it would lead. It would likely lead to more pain. Another kind of cage. It was the only choice she had ever known. And yet, the silence of this man, the stark simplicity of his gesture, felt different. It was clean, uncomplicated. He was not smiling. He was not coaxing. He was just there. Her own hand trembled as she lifted it from her lap. It was caked in dirt, the nails broken. It looked small and frail as it moved through the air. Hesitation made her fingers twitch. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to pull back. But the absolute exhaustion, the feeling of having nothing left to lose, was a powerful motivator. What more could be taken from her? Slowly, tentatively, her fingers brushed against the worn leather of his glove. The material was warm from the sun, solid and real. It did not grab or clutch, it simply remained there. Waiting. She took a shuddering breath, the dust catching in her throat, and closed her hand around his. His grip was firm, strong, and instantly secure around hers. It was not gentle, but it was not harsh either. It was just solid, a fixed point in a dizzying world. And with that single point of contact, a silent agreement was made on the side of a forgotten road, under the relentless gaze of the sun. He had offered a hand, and she had taken it. He pulled her to her feet. The movement was efficient, his strength undeniable. Yet he used no more force than was necessary. Once she was standing, swaying slightly from dizziness and exhaustion. He released her hand immediately. The connection was broken as cleanly as it had been made. He turned without a word and led his horse, the big roan, toward the dusty track that passed for a road. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply started walking, his pace slow and measured, the horse falling into step beside him. For a moment, Marla remained frozen, a statue of dust and desperation. Her mind, slow to catch up, wrestled with the reality of the situation. He was leaving, but he was walking, not riding. It took her another long second to understand. He was pacing himself to her. It was a silent expectation, an assumption that she would and could follow, with a will that felt dredged up from some deep, forgotten well within her. She put one foot in front of the other. The journey was a blur of sun and rhythmic movement. The thud of Calder's boots, the soft clopping of the horse's hooves, and the rasp of her own breathing were the only sounds. The world seemed to have shrunk to this small, slow procession. He never spoke. He never turned to offer a word of encouragement or a question. He just walked, a steady, implacable presence ahead of her. The sun crawled across the sky, and long, distorted shadows began to stretch from the sparse vegetation. She focused on the back of his shirt, the way the worn fabric moved across his shoulders. It became her anchor, the one fixed point in a swaying, heat-drenched world. Her feet burned, her muscles quivered with the strain, but she kept moving, propelled forward by a strange, new feeling. The fear of being left behind again was now stronger than the fear of where she might be going. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that her legs would fold and leave her in the dust for good, the landscape shifted. The endless flatland gave way to a gentle rise, and nestled in a shallow dip was a small homestead. It was not a grand ranch, but a place built for survival. A modest, sturdily built cabin of weathered pine sat beside a larger, more imposing barn. A simple corral, its posts silvered by the sun, stood empty. Everything about the place spoke of solitude and hard work. There were no flowers in a window box, no rocking chair on the small porch. It was a place of function, not comfort, and it seemed to match the man who led her to it. He led the horse to a trough by the well, letting it drink long and deep. Marla stopped near the porch, her legs trembling uncontrollably now that they were allowed to rest. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture she fell into without thought. She watched as Calder unsaddled the roan with practiced, economical movements. Every gesture was precise, with no wasted energy. He ran a hand down the horse's flank, murmuring something too low for her to hear. It was the first time she had heard his voice, and it was little more than a low rumble, a sound meant for the animal, not for her. After settling the horse in the barn, he emerged, his shadow long in the failing light. He walked not to the cabin, but to the well in the center of the yard. The creak of the pulley was loud in the evening stillness as he lowered the bucket. When he hauled it back up, brimming with dark, clear water, he carried it over to the side of the cabin where a small, shielded washstand stood. He set the heavy bucket down, then disappeared inside the house for a moment. He returned with a small, lye soap bar and a piece of clean, worn linen. He placed them beside the bucket. Then he turned and looked at her. It was the first time he had fully faced her since the road. His expression was as unreadable as before. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the washstand. That was all. He then walked to the far side of the corral, his back to the cabin, and began mending a loose rail, his movements suggesting he would be occupied for some time. The message was clear. The water was for her. The space was hers. He would not watch. Marla approached the washstand as if it were a trap. The water in the bucket was so still it perfectly reflected the darkening indigo sky. She dipped her hand in. The cold was a shocking pleasure, a jolt that cleared some of the fog from her mind. Hesitantly, she began to wash. She scrubbed the layers of dirt and dried sweat from her face, her neck, her arms. The water turned gray in the basin. The lye soap stung the scrapes on her hands, but it was a clean pain, a purifying one. Each stroke felt like she was washing away more than just the grime of the road. She was washing away the scent of the wagon, the feel of the dust, the lingering ghost of another's touch. When she was done, she felt raw and new, the evening air cool on her damp skin. She was drying her face on the soft linen when the cabin door creaked open. Calder stood there, a bowl in each hand. He gestured for her to come inside. The cabin's interior was as sparse as its exterior. A single room served as kitchen, dining, and living space. A stone hearth stood cold on one wall. A simple table with 2 chairs was in the center. Everything was meticulously clean, a place swept free of clutter and dust. A closed door presumably led to his sleeping quarters, and a ladder led to a small loft. He set the bowls on the table. They were filled with a thin porridge, steam rising in a faint wisp. It smelled of oats and nothing else. He took one chair, leaving the other for her. Marla sat down slowly, her movements stiff. They ate in the same profound silence that had defined their journey. There was only the scrape of spoons against the wooden bowls. He ate like he did everything else, with a steady, unhurried focus. He did not look at her. His gaze was directed at his bowl, or at some point on the far wall. The silence was not empty. It was filled with unspoken things. Marla had been raised in a world where silence was a threat, a prelude to violence or a sign of simmering anger. But this was different. This silence was a space. It was a boundary, a wall he had erected that kept the world out, and he was allowing her to stand inside it with him. He asked no questions. He did not demand to know her name, where she had come from, or why she had been beaten and left on the road. Her past was her own, a territory he made no move to invade. The quiet was a gesture of respect, more profound than any gentle words could have been. When they finished, he took her bowl, along with his, and washed them in a basin. He then gestured to the ladder. "The loft," he said. His voice was raspy from disuse, low and flat. It was not a command, but a statement of fact. He then took a neatly folded garment from a chest and laid it at the base of the ladder. It was a man's nightshirt, patched at the elbow but scrubbed clean. He turned his back to her, facing the hearth, and began laying the wood for a morning fire. Though it was hours away, he busied himself with the kindling, the flue, a dozen small tasks that kept his attention and his body oriented away from her. He was giving her privacy again, in the most absolute way he could within the confines of a single room. Marla climbed the ladder, the rough-hewn rungs solid beneath her bare feet. The loft was small, containing only a simple mattress stuffed with straw and a pair of thick wool blankets. A small, shuttered window was cut into the eaves. It was not a room, but it was a space apart. It was high up. It felt safer than any place she had been in years. She picked up the nightshirt. It was large and smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. She quickly shed her filthy calico dress, the fabric stiff with grime, and pulled the soft cotton shirt over her head. It fell to her knees, swallowing her small frame. As she did so, she listened. Below, the sounds continued: the soft scrape of wood on stone, the rustle of kindling. He never once paused. He never once turned. He kept his back to her, a silent, unmovable guardian of her dignity. She lay down on the mattress, pulling a blanket over herself. Through the cracks in the floorboards, she could see him below. He finished with the hearth and moved on to cleaning a piece of tack, his hands working the leather with oil and a soft cloth. She watched his hands. She had noticed it when he was tending his horse, and she saw it again now. Despite the grime of his work, his hands themselves were clean. He kept his fingernails short and scrubbed. It was a small detail, the kind of thing no one else would notice. But to her, it seemed significant. It spoke of a meticulous nature, of a man who took care of things: his tools, his animals, himself. She lay there in the quiet dark, listening to the small sounds of a man living his life. She was a stranger in his home, a piece of trouble he had picked up off the road for reasons she couldn't fathom. He had offered her water, food, and shelter, all without asking for a single thing in return. He hadn't even asked for her name. He had given her something far more valuable: silence. A quiet promise that she would not be harmed, would not be questioned, would not be invaded. In the deep, profound stillness of that lonely cabin, Marla felt a single, fragile seed of safety begin to take root in the barren soil of her heart. For the first time in a very long time, she closed her eyes without fear. Sleep did not come easily. It was a shallow, restless thing, a thin layer of ice over a deep, cold lake of exhaustion. Marla drifted in and out of consciousness in the loft, keenly aware of the unfamiliarity of everything. The scent of the straw mattress was dry and sweet, a world away from the sour smells of the places she had been forced to inhabit. The air was clean, carrying the faint, crisp perfume of the high desert at night. Below, she could hear the occasional soft creak of floorboards as Calder moved about the cabin, his presence a quiet, constant weight in the space beneath her. She listened to the sounds of him banking the fire for the night, the soft scrape of the poker against stone. She heard the decisive thud of a bar being dropped into place across the door. It was a sound that should have frightened her, the sound of being locked in. But here, it felt different. It was not to keep her in, but to keep the vast, dangerous emptiness of the world out. He was not her jailer. He was the cabin's silent warden, guarding its perimeter against the night. After a time, all movement ceased. The silence that fell was absolute, a profound quiet that seemed to press in from the plains, a stillness so deep it felt alive. In this quiet, she finally allowed her body to uncoil, to release a tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. Sleep, true and deep, was finally pulling her under. The change began subtly, a low moan of wind, a whisper that snaked through the eaves of the cabin. It was a different sound from the gentle night breeze. This was a sound with teeth, a restless, searching sound that grew steadily in pitch and power. The cabin, which had felt so solid, gave a slight shudder, a groan of old wood settling against a new pressure. Marla's eyes opened in the darkness. She lay perfectly still, listening. Then came the first flicker of light, a silent, ghostly illumination that bleached the room of color for a split second. followed by a profound, waiting darkness. It was lightning, far off on the horizon. A few heartbeats later, a low rumble rolled across the land. It was not a sharp crack, but a deep, guttural growl, the sound of a far-off beast stirring in its sleep. The storm was coming. For another person, this might have been a simple inconvenience, a reason to pull the blankets tighter. But for Marla, that sound was a key. It turned a lock deep inside her, opening a door to a place she tried to keep sealed shut. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. The wind howled louder, a rising shriek. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, lit the loft with a stark, blue-white glare, throwing the rough-hewn timbers into sharp relief. It was followed almost immediately by a much louder peal of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. And with that crack of sound, she was no longer in the loft. She was small again, shivering in a thin shift behind the saloon her mother had worked in. The sky had opened up, a torrential, punishing downpour that turned the dusty alley into a river of mud. The door was locked. She had been cast out for some minor, forgotten transgression, and the sound of laughter from inside was a faint, cruel counterpoint to the roar of the storm. She remembered pounding on the thick wood, her small fists raw, her voice lost in the thunder. She remembered the cold, how it seeped into her bones, a cold that was more than just the rain. It was the cold of abandonment, of knowing you were utterly alone and worthless. The cabin's roof rattled as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Sparse at first, then thickening into a deafening torrent. Each drop striking the shingles was like a tiny fist hammering on a locked door. Marla sat bolt upright on the mattress, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls of the loft, which had felt like a safe embrace, now seemed to be closing in, shrinking, becoming a cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were burned on the inside of her eyelids, the slick, muddy wood of the door, the lightning reflecting in the puddles at her feet, the terrifying, absolute certainty that no one was coming to let her in. A violent crack of thunder directly overhead made her cry out, a small, choked sound that was swallowed by the storm's fury. The entire cabin shuddered. This was too much. The memory was no longer a memory. It was happening now. The fear was a physical thing, a suffocating pressure on her chest. She couldn't breathe. She had to get out. But out meant the storm. And the storm was the memory. She was trapped. A desperate primal instinct took over, overriding reason. She scrambled from the mattress, her bare feet finding the top rung of the ladder. She had to move, had to escape the suffocating confines of the loft. Below, the main room was a cavern of shadows, made stark and strange by the intermittent flashes of lightning that pierced the gloom through the single window. She saw the barred door and a fresh wave of panic washed over her. Locked in. But there was another door, the one to his room. Her mind recoiled from the thought. To approach the man, to intrude on his space, was a terrifying prospect. He was a stranger, a hard, silent man whose kindness so far had been defined by the distance he kept. To cross that distance felt like a violation of the unspoken truce between them. He would be angry. He would cast her out, back into the storm, back into the memory. Another deafening crash of thunder shook her to the core. A sob tore from her throat. The fear of the storm was greater than the fear of the man. It was a terrible calculus, but the choice was made. Trembling so hard she could barely stand, she stumbled across the cold floorboards. Her hand, icy and shaking, rose to the wooden door of his room. She hesitated, her knuckles hovering just inches from the surface. This was madness. What could he possibly do? What could she possibly say? She knocked. It wasn't a real knock. It was the faintest of taps, the sound a mouse might make scratching at a wall. It was lost in the roar of the rain. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. Nothing. Of course, nothing. He couldn't have heard. She gathered what little courage she had left and knocked again, a little harder this time. 3 frantic, desperate taps. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm. Then, she heard a faint creak from within. A floorboard. He was awake. He was moving. The door opened. Calder stood there, a tall, imposing silhouette against the faint light filtering from his own window. He wore only his trousers, his chest and shoulders bare, a landscape of hard muscle and old, faded scars that the lightning briefly, cruelly illuminated. He did not look surprised or angry. He simply looked at her, his pale eyes seeming to absorb the entirety of her state in a single, sweeping glance, the wild terror in her eyes, the way she trembled from head to toe, the oversized nightshirt clinging to her small frame. He did not speak. He did not ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He could see the storm that was raging inside her was far more violent than the one outside. Marla opened her mouth to try and explain, to stammer out an apology, but no words came. Her throat was tight with fear. All she could do was stand there, shaking, a pathetic waif on his doorstep. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes flicked up toward the loft, then back to her. A flicker of something not pity, but perhaps understanding passed through his expression. So quick she might have imagined it. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Bring your blanket," he said. His voice was a low rasp, but it cut through the noise of the storm. It was not a question. It was not an invitation. It was a simple, practical instruction. He then stepped back into his room, leaving the door open, and walked over to his bed. Sitting on the edge with his back to her, he was giving her the choice to follow, and the privacy to do so. Clutching the worn nightshirt, Marla hesitated for only a second before scurrying back up the ladder. She grabbed one of the thick wool blankets, bundling it in her arms like a shield. She descended again and slipped through the open doorway into his room. It was even more Spartan than the main cabin. A simple bed frame with another straw mattress, a wooden chest at its foot, and a rifle rack on the wall holding a long-barreled Winchester. The room smelled of him of clean linen, worn leather, and the faint, dusty scent of the plains. He did not turn or acknowledge her entrance. He just sat on his bed, a silent, unmoving mountain. She did not dare go any further into the room. She retreated to the farthest corner, as far away from him as the small space would allow, and sank to the floor. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders, pulling her knees to her chest, and tried to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She was an intruder, a stray dog he had allowed in from the rain, and she was terrified of overstaying her welcome. They sat like that in the darkness, separated by 10 feet of floorboards and an ocean of silence, while the storm raged outside. The lightning flashes were constant now, turning the small room into a flickering, disorienting stage. The thunder was a physical blow, vibrating through the floor and up into her bones. With every crack, she flinched, burying her face deeper into her knees. A single, sharp sob escaped her, a sound of pure, helpless terror that she couldn't hold back. She heard a rustle of movement from the bed. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. He was going to tell her to be quiet. He was going to throw her out. But he didn't get up. He was still sitting on the edge of the bed. Slowly, he reached down and took the corner of the top blanket from his own bed. He didn't say a word. He just began to pull it, unfolding it, letting it unfurl across the floor. It was a large, heavy thing, a patchwork quilt made of old denim and flannel. It slid silently across the wooden floorboards, a slow, inexorable tide of comfort moving through the darkness. It traveled the distance between them until its soft, worn edge came to rest against her leg. He gave it one last, gentle tug, pulling it further until it draped over her huddled form, covering her own thin blanket. He did not touch her. His hand never came close, but his blanket did. It settled over her, warm and heavy, a tangible shield. It smelled of him, that same clean wood smoke scent. It was an anchor. The weight of it was immense, grounding. It was a silent, profound gesture. He had not offered empty words of comfort. He had offered a piece of his own warmth, his own protection, and had done so without crossing the chasm of fear that separated them. Marla stared at the patchwork fabric covering her, the chaotic flashes of lightning illuminating the faded squares of blue and red. The thunder still crashed outside. The rain still hammered on the roof, but their power to terrify her had diminished. She was no longer a small, forgotten child locked out in the cold. She was in a warm, dry room, sheltered by the quiet strength of a man who spoke in actions, not words. Slowly, the frantic beating of her heart began to subside. The knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen. She let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh of relief, under the weight of his blanket, cocooned in a silence that was no longer threatening. Marla's eyelids grew heavy. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, inside the small circle of warmth he had extended to her, a fragile peace began to fall, and for the first time in more years than she could count, she drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep. She woke to a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible, aching blue and air that smelled of wet earth and sage. A pale, gentle light filtered into Calder's room, tracing the lines of the rifle on the wall and the weave of the patchwork quilt that was still draped over her. For a moment, she didn't move, her body still holding the memory of a deep and profound rest she hadn't known was possible. The fear from the night before was a distant echo, a bad dream that had been banished by the morning. A soft clink of metal on ceramic drifted in from the main room. He was awake. A flush of embarrassment, hot and swift, crept up her neck. She was on the floor of his room. She had fled to him like a frightened child. The intimacy of the situation, however chaste, was unnerving. She expected awkwardness, perhaps a gruff word of dismissal now that the storm was over and her moment of weakness had passed. Carefully, she folded his quilt, her hands smoothing the worn fabric. She placed it neatly on the foot of his bed, an unspoken thank you. Her own blanket she gathered in her arms, and with a deep, fortifying breath, she slipped out of the room. Calder was at the hearth, tending a small fire. A tin coffee pot sat near the flames, sending a rich, bracing aroma into the cool morning air. He didn't look up as she emerged, but she knew he was aware of her. His stillness had a quality of immense perception. He seemed to notice everything without ever needing to look directly at it. She scurried up the ladder to the loft, her bare feet silent on the wood, and deposited her blanket. When she returned, a tin mug of steaming black coffee was sitting on the table, waiting for her. He was by the open cabin door now, looking out at the damp, glistening land, his own mug in hand. He had not mentioned the night. He had not asked if she was all right. He simply went about his morning, his routine as steady and predictable as the sunrise, and had included her in it with the simple, silent offering of a cup of coffee. That gesture, more than any words could have, eased the knot of shame in her stomach. Her panic had not been a burden to him. It had simply been a fact, like the storm itself, and now it was over. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Marla found her place in the small cabin not through instruction, but through observation. She watched how he did things and followed suit. She swept the cabin floor, washed their few dishes, and learned to grind the coffee beans. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds but holding the promise of life. She began to tend to it, her fingers sinking into the cool, damp earth, pulling up the invasive growth with a fierce, quiet satisfaction. Each weed she removed felt like clearing a space in her own tangled past. Calder worked from sunup to sundown. He mended fences, tended to his horse, and disappeared for long stretches into the vast rangeland that was his home. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, solid thing. He was the force that kept this small, lonely homestead from being swallowed by the wilderness. One afternoon, a few days after the storm, he brought in 2 large sacks of dried beans. He emptied them into a wide, shallow basin on the porch and began the slow, meditative task of sorting them, picking out the small stones and bits of chaff. Marla, having finished her work in the garden, came and sat on the porch steps, watching him. After a few minutes of silence, he pushed the basin slightly toward her, an unspoken invitation to join him. She began to help, her small hands moving through the smooth, cool beans. It was a rhythmic, peaceful task. The only sounds were the soft rattle of the beans, the distant cry of a hawk, and the gentle sigh of the wind. They worked side by side, 2 solitary figures sharing a small square of shade. It was in this profound and gentle quiet that the wound inside her finally chose to open. She did not plan to speak. The words simply came, softly at first, a current of memory rising to the surface. Her voice was low, hardly more than a whisper, as if she were afraid of disturbing the stillness. "My father," she began, her fingers pausing over a small, misshapen bean. He would have liked this place. It's quiet. He liked the quiet. Calder's hands did not stop their steady, sorting motion. He gave no sign that he had heard, save for a subtle shift in his posture, a deep stillness that went beyond mere concentration. He was listening, encouraged by his silence, a silence that did not judge or interrupt. She continued. "He was a good man, a carpenter. He could make anything from wood. He taught me my letters, writing them in sawdust on the workshop floor. He smelled of pine and hard work." A faint, sad smile touched her lips for a moment. When he died, the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was just empty. She fell silent, the weight of that emptiness settling over her again. The rattle of the beans was the only sound. She looked at Calder's profile. His face was hard, impassive, his eyes fixed on the task before him. But he was giving her the space to speak, a gift she hadn't realized she so desperately needed. "Things got hard after that," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "My mother, she was not a strong woman. The world was too sharp for her. There were debts. My father had been ill for a long time." She took a shaky breath, the next words tasting like ash in her mouth. "There was a man, a saloon owner in Silver Bluff. He held the debt. My mother, she did what she thought she had to do to settle it. She made a bargain." Marla's hand stilled completely. She stared down at the beans, their smooth, patterned surfaces blurring through a film of tears she refused to let fall. "I was part of the bargain." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. She had never said those words aloud to anyone. They had been her secret shame, a brand on her soul. "He was not a good man," she whispered, the words tumbling out now, hurried and broken. "He had a heavy hand and a quick temper. He didn't need a reason. Some men are just built of anger." He looked at me and saw a thing he owned, like a chair or a bottle of whiskey, something to be used and discarded. When I ran, he said he would find me. That property doesn't just walk away. She finally fell silent, her story told. All the pain and humiliation of the past few years had been distilled into those few, whispered sentences. She felt hollowed out, utterly exposed. She waited for Calder's reaction, a word of pity, a grunt of disgust, an awkward shifting away from her. She expected him to get up and leave, the ugliness of her past too much to share the small porch with. He did none of those things. He continued to sort the beans. His large hands moved with the same deliberate, unhurried rhythm as before. He picked out a small, gray stone, examined it for a moment, and tossed it into the dust. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He offered no reaction at all. His silence was a vast, empty canyon into which she had thrown her painful story. For a terrifying moment, She thought it was a silence of indifference, that her words had meant nothing to him. She felt a familiar, sickening lurch of worthlessness. But as the minutes stretched on, she began to understand. His silence was not empty. It was absorbent. He had taken her words, her pain, and had simply held it, without judgment, without comment. He hadn't flinched from the ugliness. He hadn't offered her the cheap, easy coin of pity. He had listened. He had heard her, and he had not turned away. He had simply continued to sort the beans. His steady presence a solid wall she could lean against, even from a distance. When the last bean was sorted, he stood up, his joints cracking softly. He took the basin of clean beans inside the cabin. He did not look at her as he passed. The porch felt suddenly empty, the afternoon sun cold on her skin. She remained on the steps, feeling raw and strangely lighter, as if a fever had broken. The next morning, she woke early, the habit of a lifetime. The cabin was quiet. Calder was already gone. She assumed he was out on the range. She went about the morning chores, moving with a newfound sense of purpose. The confession of the day before, instead of breaking her, had strangely solidified her presence there. She had shared the worst of herself, and he had not sent her away. It was when she went to the well for water that she heard it. A strange, rhythmic sound coming from the barn. A steady, solid thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a hammer driving nails into wood. Curious. She walked toward the barn, the damp earth cool beneath her bare feet. She stopped in her tracks at the entrance, the old barn door. A weathered, splintered thing that had hung crookedly on a worn leather hinge was gone. It lay in pieces on the ground nearby. In its place was a new door. It was made of thick, fresh-sawn pine, the wood still pale and smelling sharply of resin. It was cross-braced with heavy timbers, held together by large, black-headed nails. The hinges were not leather, but heavy, black iron, bolted firmly into the door and the frame. A thick, sturdy crossbeam, designed to be barred from the inside, lay on the ground, ready to be fitted. It was a fortress of a door, solid, impenetrable, safe. She reached out and touched the raw wood. It was still warm from the morning sun. She looked past it, into the barn's dusty interior, and saw him. Calder was at his workbench, planing a rough edge from another piece of timber, his back to her. The muscles in his shoulders and back moved with a powerful, focused grace. The hammer lay on the bench beside him. He must have worked through the night, or started long before the sun had risen. Marla looked from the man to the door, and suddenly she understood. This was his response. This was his reaction to her story. He had not offered her words. He had not promised her that the man from her past would not come looking for her. He had not said, "I will protect you." He had built protection. He had taken her fear and her pain, and with his own two hands, he had forged it into wood and iron. He was making the homestead safer. He was reinforcing the walls, strengthening the perimeter. He was ensuring that every part of this small sanctuary was secure. The door was not just a door. It was a statement. It was a promise. It was everything he had not said, made solid and real. He must have felt her eyes on him, because he stopped his work. He turned slowly and looked at her, standing in the frame of his new door. His pale eyes met hers across the dusty space. There was no softness in his gaze, but there was a deep, unwavering steadiness. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned back to his workbench and picked up his plane. The work was not yet finished. The new barn door became the silent center of their world, every morning. When Marla stepped out of the cabin, it was the first thing she saw, solid and reassuring in the pale light. It was a testament, a promise rendered in pine and iron. The act of sliding the heavy bar across at night was a shared ritual, a final, definitive closing of the door on the day and the world outside. The sound of it slotting into place was the sound of safety. With this newfound security, something inside Marla began to unfurl. She poured her energy into the small patch of earth behind the cabin, coaxing life from the soil with a patient, fierce devotion. She found forgotten packets of seeds in a tin box in the barn beans, squash, and hardy greens. The neat rows she planted were a stark contrast to the wild, untamed landscape that surrounded them. Her garden was an act of hope, an assertion of order in a world of chaos. Calder never commented on her work, but one evening he left a well-oiled spade and a hoe with a new handle leaning against the cabin wall, right where she would find them. A comfortable, quiet domesticity settled over them. It was a life measured not in words, but in shared tasks and mutual awareness. It was in the way she knew to have a cup of coffee ready for him when he came in from the cold pre-dawn air, and the way he knew to leave a bucket of fresh well water for her garden on the hottest afternoons. She mended the tears in his shirts, her stitches small and neat, erasing the signs of wear. He, in turn, replaced a broken rung on the loft ladder and sharpened the blade of the kitchen knife until it could slice through a potato with a whisper. They were two solitary planets who had fallen into a shared, silent orbit, each held in place by the quiet gravity of the other. One afternoon, the rhythm was broken. Calder had been working for days with a young gelding, a spirited bay with a wild eye and muscles that coiled like a spring. He was trying to break it to the saddle, a process he approached with the same immense, unwavering patience he applied to everything else. He did not use force or fear, but a quiet language of pressure and release, a slow and steady conversation with the animal. Marla often watched from the porch, marveling at the silent dance between the man and the horse. On this day, however, the dance turned violent. The gelding, spooked by the sudden flight of a jackrabbit from the sagebrush, exploded. It was a terrifying spectacle of raw power, a whirlwind of bucking, twisting muscle. For a few heartbeats, Calder moved with the horse, a seamless part of its frantic energy. But the animal's panic was too great. It reared, screaming, its front hooves lashing at the sky. And in that moment, it unseated him. He was thrown, not far, but hard. He landed with a sickening thud, his shoulder colliding with one of the thick posts of the corral fence. The gelding, its panic spent, trotted to the far side of the enclosure, its sides heaving, its eyes still wide with fright. Marla's heart leaped into her throat. She was on her feet before she even realized she had moved, her hands clenched at her sides. She expected him to lie still, broken, but after a moment that stretched for an eternity, he pushed himself up, first to his knees, then slowly, stiffly, to his feet. He did not look at his shoulder. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horse. He stood there for a long time, letting the animal's fear subside, before he walked calmly toward it, his movements measured and deliberate, his voice a low, soothing murmur she could not quite hear. She watched, her breath held, as he gentled the horse, running a hand down its trembling neck. He checked its legs, then quietly led it into the barn. The entire incident was over in minutes. Calder emerged from the barn a short while later and went about his evening chores as if nothing had happened. But Marla had seen the way he moved, the slight, almost imperceptible stiffness in his left shoulder, the way he favored his right arm as he carried a bucket of feed. He was hurt, and he was hiding it. Later, as twilight bled across the sky, he came into the cabin. The air was cool, and Marla was stirring a pot of bean soup over the fire. He walked to the wash basin, his back to her, and splashed water on his face and neck. When he reached for the towel, a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped his lips as he lifted his left arm. Marla turned from the fire, the wooden spoon still in her hand. "You're hurt," she said. The words were quiet, a simple statement of fact, but they were the most direct she had ever been with him. He didn't answer. He finished drying his face and turned around. His expression was a shuttered mask, but she could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow and the tight lines of pain etched around his mouth. His shirt, a dark blue chambray, was torn at the shoulder, and a darker, damp patch was spreading across the fabric. He walked to the table and sat down heavily in one of the chairs. He tried to reach behind him, to peel the damp fabric away from his skin, but the movement was awkward and clearly painful. He stopped, his jaw tight. In that moment, Marla saw not the implacable, self-sufficient man who had pulled her from the dust, but someone vulnerable, someone in need. Her own history of pain, of being the one who was always hurt, receded. A new, unfamiliar instinct rose in its place, the desire to soothe, to care for. She put the spoon down and went to the chest where she kept the clean linens. She took out a soft, worn cloth and a small bowl, which she filled with warm water from the kettle on the hearth. She carried them to the table and set them down. He watched her, his pale eyes following her every movement, his expression unreadable. She stood beside him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Let me," she whispered. It was not a question. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, hesitation, maybe even a hint of his own vulnerability that he was loath to show. She thought he would refuse, that his pride would not allow it. But then, he gave a slow, single nod. He turned his back to her, a silent gesture of acquiescence, of trust. Her hands trembled as she reached for the buttons of his shirt. The small, polished bits of bone felt foreign beneath her fingertips. She had never touched him. Not really, not like this. She worked the buttons free, one by one, her movements clumsy. With the last one undone, she gently took the fabric in her hands and pulled it forward, off his shoulders. The shirt fell away, and she drew in a sharp, involuntary breath. The sight of his bare back stole the air from her lungs. It was a landscape of taut muscle and sun-darkened skin, crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. But it was the new injury that held her gaze. A long, brutal scrape ran from his shoulder blade down to the small of his back. It was an angry red, oozing blood, and dotted with splinters from the fence post. A wave of dizziness washed over her. A hot blush climbed her neck and flooded her cheeks. This was an intimacy she was completely unprepared for. The sight of him, so exposed, so raw, was overwhelming. Men's bodies, in her experience, were instruments of threat and violence. But this was different. This was just a man who was hurt, and he was letting her help him. She forced her trembling hands to be steady. She dipped the cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and hesitated for a fraction of a second before touching it to his skin. His muscles flinched, tensing under her touch, but he made no sound. She began to clean the wound, her movements tentative at first, then growing more confident. She worked with a delicate, focused precision, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. She carefully picked out the tiny splinters of wood, her breath held in concentration. The world shrank to this small, quiet task, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the clean, metallic scent of his blood, the soft sound of the cloth against his flesh. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way the fine hairs on his neck curled. She was so lost in the task, so focused on causing him as little pain as possible, that the words slipped out of her before she could stop them. They were a soft, reflexive whisper, a question born from a deep, ingrained memory of her own pain. "Will it hurt?" The question hung in the quiet air between them. As soon as she said it, she wished she could take it back. It was a foolish, childish thing to say. Of course it would hurt. Calder went completely still. The muscles in his back, which had been tense with pain, now seemed to freeze into stone. For a long moment, he didn't move or speak. Marla's hand hovered above his back, the damp cloth suddenly heavy. She thought she had angered him, had broken the fragile trust with her stupid question. Then, slowly, he turned. He didn't just turn his head, he shifted his entire body in the chair to face her. She had to take a step back. He looked up at her, and the expression in his eyes was one she had never seen before. The cold, iron-like hardness was gone. In its place was a look of profound, aching gentleness. It was a look that saw past the bruised and frightened girl he had found on the road and seemed to peer directly into her soul. He raised his hand, the one that wasn't injured, and cupped her jaw. His calloused thumb stroked her cheek, right over the spot where her own bruise had long since faded. His touch was so light, so tender, it was almost unbearable. He leaned forward, not with speed, but with a slow, deliberate grace. Marla's breath hitched. She thought he was going to kiss her lips, and a jolt of panic and a strange, fluttering anticipation shot through her. But he didn't. He simply tilted his head and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of benediction, of reverence. It was a silent promise of safety, a gentle sealing of all the unspoken words that had passed between them. It lasted only a moment, but it felt like a lifetime. When he drew back, his eyes were still locked on hers. He leaned in close, his voice a low, rough whisper, a sound meant only for her. "Only until you say my name." The words settled into her heart like a warm, heavy stone. My name. She had never said it. She had thought of him, as the cowboy, as the man who had saved her. But she had never formed the sound of his name, Calder, on her lips. His simple, profound statement linked his healing to her voice, to her acknowledgement of him as a person, not just a protector. He was giving her a strange and beautiful power, the power to soothe him. And in that moment, something inside her broke. It wasn't a violent shattering, but a quiet, deep fracturing of the wall she had built around her heart. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Then another, soon. A silent, steady stream was flowing. She didn't make a sound. She didn't sob or gasp. She just stood before him, the forgotten cloth still in her hand, as the tears she had held back for a lifetime finally fell. They were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, tears for the kindness she had never known, for the gentleness she had never believed was possible. She was crying because a man's touch had not brought her pain, but had instead offered a healing she didn't even know she needed. She was crying because, for the first time in her life, she felt cherished. The weeks that followed his injury were a season of quiet healing, not just for the bruised muscles in his back, but for the fragile trust blooming between them. A tender, unspoken language grew in the space his words left vacant. It was a language of gestures, of shared glances, of tasks anticipated and completed in a silent, seamless partnership. Marla no longer felt like a refugee in his home. She felt like a part of it, as rooted and essential as the stone hearth. The fear that had been her constant companion for years began to recede, its sharp edges worn smooth by the steady, predictable rhythm of their days. She found herself humming as she worked in her garden, a small, tuneless sound she hadn't realized she was capable of making. Sometimes, she would look up from weeding a row of beans and find Calder watching her from the barn doorway, his expression as still and unreadable as ever. But he would hold her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to his work. In those moments, a warmth would spread through her chest, a feeling so new and precious she was afraid to give it a name. The homestead, once a place of stark survival, began to feel like a home. It was no longer just his sanctuary. It was theirs. The peace was broken on a Tuesday. The iron strapping on a wagon wheel had worked itself loose, and it was a repair that required the heat of a forge and a blacksmith's heavy hammer. It meant a trip to Prairie Ridge, the small, dusty settlement that was the closest thing to a town for 50 miles. It was a full day's ride there and back. Calder prepared to leave at first light. Marla watched him saddle the big roan, his movements as economical and precise as always. He checked the cinch, adjusted the bridle, and tied a small sack of supplies, a canteen of water, and a piece of dried beef wrapped in cloth that she had prepared for him behind the candle. He was all business, his focus entirely on the task ahead. When he was ready, he turned to her. She stood on the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron. She expected him to simply nod and leave, as was his way. Instead, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The bar on the door," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Keep it in place." It was not a suggestion. It was a quiet command, a reminder that even in this peaceful bubble they had created, the world outside still held its dangers. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Be safe," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He held her gaze for a long moment, then swung himself up into the saddle. He rode out without a backward glance, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, empty canvas of the plains. Marla slid the heavy bar across the cabin door. The solid thud as it settled into its brackets was a comforting sound. But today, with him gone, it also felt like the closing of a cage. The silence of the homestead, usually a comfort, felt vast and empty without him in it. The ride to Prairie Ridge was uneventful. Calder moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man who knew the land and was in no particular hurry. The sun climbed, the heat settled in, and the world was reduced to the creak of leather and the rhythmic plod of his horse. Prairie Ridge was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery, and the blacksmith shop, its wide doors open like a dark, gaping mouth. A pall of black smoke hung in the still air above its roof. He dismounted and led the roan toward the smithy, the sound of a hammer striking an anvil ringing out to meet him. Walt, the blacksmith, was a mountain of a man with arms like tree limbs and a beard stained with soot. He greeted Calder with a grunt of acknowledgement, his work never ceasing. "Boone," he said, his voice a gravelly boom that competed with the clang of his hammer. "What's broke?" "Wagon wheel," Calder said, his voice quiet in the cavernous, noisy space. "Straps come loose." Walt gestured with his hammer toward the back. "Bring it around. Might get to it before sundown. Might not." Calder nodded and went to retrieve the heavy wheel from where he'd left it leaning against the outside wall. As he rolled it into the smithy, two other men who had been talking near the quenching trough turned to look at him. They were local ranchers, men he knew by sight but not by name. They nodded, and he nodded back, his face a neutral mask. He preferred to conduct his business and leave. The idle chatter of the town held no interest for him. He was about to retreat to the shade of the overhang to wait when a fragment of their conversation caught his ear. "Came through yesterday," one of the ranchers was saying, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Fanciest vest I ever saw on a man who smelled that sour. Looked like a riverboat gambler who'd lost his boat." The other man chuckled. "Heard him over at the saloon, asking questions." A lot of questions. Calder, who had been turning to leave, went very still. His body remained relaxed, but an intense, focused quiet fell over him. He leaned against the doorframe, feigning casual interest, his hat brim pulled low. Questions about what Walt the blacksmith asked. His curiosity piqued. He set his hammer down with a clang and picked up a pair of tongs. Plunging a glowing piece of iron into the trough, the water hissed and boiled violently. "A girl," the first rancher said. "That's what got my ear. Asking if anyone had seen a girl. About 19, dark hair. Said she was his property. Ran off from him near Silver Bluff a few weeks back." The air in Calder's lungs seemed to turn to ice. He did not move a muscle. He kept his eyes on the ground, his face a mask of stone, but his hearing sharpened to a razor's edge, filtering out the hiss of the steam and the buzz of flies to focus only on the man's words. Property Walt snorted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "What kind of man talks about a girl like that?" "The kind you don't turn your back on," the rancher said, his voice dropping slightly. "Name's Blackwood, Silas Blackwood. Runs a saloon over in the next territory. Said he paid good money for her and that he aims to get his investment back. Said he'd track her to the devil's front door if he had to." had a nasty look in his eye when he said it. 2. Silas Blackwood. The name was a poison dart, and it found its mark deep inside Calder. He felt a cold, familiar rage begin to uncoil in his gut. It was an old feeling, one he had buried with his father and brother. It was the rage of a man whose sanctuary was being threatened. "Well, ain't no girl like that passed through here." The second rancher chimed in. "This is a decent town, mostly." Calder had heard enough. He pushed himself off the doorframe, his movements calm and deliberate. He walked over to the blacksmith. "The wheel," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "I'll be back for it." Walt looked at him, a question in his eyes. "Thought you were waiting." Something came up, Calder said. He turned and walked out of the smithy, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He untied the roan, swung into the saddle, and turned the horse's head back the way he had come. He did not look back. The ride home was different. There was no placid, ground-eating pace. He pushed the roan into a hard, steady trot that bordered on a canter, a punishing speed to maintain over such a distance. The horse sensed the change in him, the grim, violent tension that radiated from his body. It responded with a nervous energy, its ears twitching, its eyes rolling. Calder did not notice the landscape. He did not feel the sun beating on his back. His world had narrowed to a single point, the image of a man with a sour smell and a fancy vest. A man who spoke of Marla as if she were a piece of livestock. A man who was hunting her. A man who was, therefore, hunting him. It was late afternoon when Marla heard the horse. It was too early for him to be back, and the sound of the hooves was wrong. It was not the steady, calm rhythm of Calder's approach. This was the sound of urgency, of a horse being pushed hard. A cold spike of fear went through her. She ran to the cabin door, her heart pounding, and peered out. She saw him emerge over the rise, the roan lathered in sweat. He rode directly into the yard and swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a complete stop. He didn't look at her. His face was a thundercloud. His jaw set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He stripped the saddle from the horse with a few rough, angry movements, and all but threw it over the corral fence before stalking toward the cabin. Marla shrank back from the door as he entered. A cold, menacing energy came off him in waves, an aura of contained violence that sucked all the warmth from the room. He walked past her as if she wasn't there. "Calder," she whispered, her voice trembling. He ignored her. He went directly to the rifle rack on the wall and took down the heavy Winchester. The metallic click as he pulled it from its holdings was unnaturally loud in the silent cabin. He walked to the wooden chest where he kept his supplies and took out a box of cartridges. He sat at the table and, with movements that were both steady and terrifyingly precise, he began to load the rifle. Click! Slide! Click! The sound was methodical, final. Each cartridge he pushed into the chamber was a punctuation mark in a sentence she could not bear to read. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now, laced with a rising panic. "What's happened?" He finished loading the rifle and set it on the table. Then he unbuckled the holster that hung from a peg by the door and strapped it around his waist. He checked the Colt revolver that sat in the holster, spinning the cylinder, his thumb moving with practiced familiarity. He was a different man from the one who had left that morning. The quiet homesteader was gone, replaced by a grim, silent predator. "You can't," she said, finally understanding. The fear was a cold hand gripping her heart. "You can't go after him." He still didn't look at her. He took a few more cartridges and began sliding them into the loops on his gun belt. "Please," she begged, stepping toward him, her hands outstretched. "Don't. It's not your fight. We can leave. We can go somewhere he'll never find us. We can run." She was babbling, the old, familiar instinct to flee taking over. It was all she had ever known. He stopped what he was doing. Slowly, he raised his head and looked at her. His eyes were no longer the color of a winter sky. They were the color of cold, hard steel. "There's nowhere to run." "Marla," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Men like that don't stop. Not ever." "But he'll kill you," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "It's not worth it. I'm not worth it." That was when he moved. He stood up, closing the distance between them in a single, long stride. He took her by the arms, his grip firm but not harsh, forcing her to be still, to look at him. "This isn't about you anymore," he said, his voice low and intense. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the small, clean cabin, at the pot of soup simmering on the hearth, at the neat stack of mended shirts on the chest. He looked at the home they had built in the silence. His eyes came back to hers, and she saw the cold rage was now mingled with a fierce, protective fire. "My father and my brother died defending this land," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying more weight than a shout. "They were killed by men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. I buried them on that hill out there." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible shake. "I will not stand by and let another man with a foul heart and greedy hands threaten this place." He looked directly into her soul, and for the first time, he let her see the full depth of his conviction, the iron core of his being. "No one lays a hand on my kin, not again." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. My kin. He had not called her a stray, or a guest, or a woman he was protecting. He had called her kin. He had claimed her, not as property, but as family. In that single breathtaking moment, he had redefined her entire world. He was not fighting for her because he pitied her, or because he felt a sense of obligation. He was fighting for her because she belonged with him, in his home, under his protection. She was his. He released her arms and turned to pick up the rifle. He walked to the door, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He paused on the threshold and looked back at her one last time. "Bar the door behind me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone." And then he was gone. A dark, resolute figure walking out into the dying light, the rifle held easy in his hand. Marla stumbled to the door and watched him go. She then did as he said, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The solid thud echoed the final, terrible beating of her own heart. The sanctuary had been breached, and the man who was its heart had just walked out to meet the wolves. The heavy bar on the cabin door was a line drawn against the world. On one side was the quiet, ordered life Marla had just begun to know. On the other was the vast, menacing unknown into which Calder had just walked. For the first hour after he left, she was paralyzed by the silence. She paced the small room, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. She tidied things that were already tidy, stoked a fire that didn't need stoking, and peered out the single window at the empty, indifferent landscape. The silence was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on her, suffocating her with what-ifs. What if he didn't come back? What if the man with the sour smell and fancy vest found him first? The man she knew as Silas Blackwood. A cruel, possessive man who saw her as nothing more than a lost ledger book, an asset to be recovered. The thought of Calder facing that brand of casual evil on her behalf was a sickness in her stomach. He was fighting her battle, and she was locked safely away, a protected treasure. The thought was unbearable. His parting words echoed in her mind. My kin. He had named her as his own, and his own did not cower behind a barred door while their family walked into a fight. The old Marla would have stayed. She would have prayed and wept and waited for fate to be decided for her. But the old Marla had been chipped away by quiet kindness, by the building of a barn door, by a gentle kiss on the forehead. A new, fragile resolve was hardening within her. She was no longer just a victim. She was kin. She stopped her pacing and looked at the rifle rack. The heavy Winchester was gone, but his father's old hunting rifle remained. It was a long, heavy-looking piece, its wooden stock dark with age and oiled by the hands of a man she would never know. She had never fired a gun in her life. The sound of one had always been a prelude to pain and fear. To touch one felt like a betrayal of every instinct she had. But the image of Calder's face, grim and determined as he walked out the door, was stronger than her fear. Her movements were clumsy, hesitant. She lifted the rifle from its pegs. It was heavier than she'd imagined, cold and solid and smelling of gun oil and old wood. She found a small leather pouch with cartridges next to the rack. She didn't know how to load it properly, but she had seen Calder do it enough times. She managed to slide a single cartridge into the chamber, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it twice. The click as she closed the breech sounded like a death sentence. With the rifle in her hands, she unbarred the door and slipped out into the dying light. She didn't know where he had gone, but there was only one trail leading from the homestead back toward Prairie Ridge. His horse's tracks were plain in the dusty earth, keeping to the cover of the low brush. She began to follow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The rifle was an awkward, heavy weight, but she clutched it like a talisman. She was not a warrior. She was not a rescuer. She was just a girl who was refusing, for the first time in her life, to simply wait. Calder did not ride far. He knew these lands, knew the paths a man would take. About 2 miles from the homestead, the trail dipped through a shallow, dry arroyo fringed with a thick grove of cottonwood and juniper. It was a natural choke point, a place where a man could be easily seen before he saw you. He tethered his horse in a dense thicket, well off the trail, and moved on foot to the edge of the grove. He found his spot on a low rise, a nest of rock and shadow that gave him a clear view of the approaching trail. He settled in, the Winchester resting easy in his hands, and he waited. His mind was clear, cold, and calm. This was not a hunt born of anger. It was an extermination. He was a rancher protecting his stock, a man protecting his home. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows. When he heard them, the sound of 3 horses, moving at a confident trot. They appeared a few minutes later, 3 dark figures against the blood red of the setting sun. The man in the lead wore a dusty bowler hat and a vest that might have once been fancy. Silas Blackwood. The 2 men with him were rough-looking, hired muscle, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. They were talking amongst themselves, laughing at some crude joke, their guard down. They believed they were the hunters, closing in on their prey. Calder raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the metal cool against his cheek. He sighted on the second man, the one on the right, and took a slow, steady breath. He did not aim for Blackwood. The snake's head was for last. He let out his breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a flat, brutal crack that shattered the evening stillness. The man on the right was thrown from his saddle as if by an invisible fist, a single neat hole appearing in the center of his chest. He was gone before he hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Blackwood and the remaining man yelled in shock and rage, wrestling their spooked horses under control. They dove from their saddles, scrambling for the meager cover of the rocks on the other side of the trail, blindly firing their pistols in the direction of the gunshot. Their bullets whined harmlessly through the cottonwood leaves high above Calder's head. Calder worked the lever on his rifle, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. He was calm. He had the high ground, the better weapon, and the righteousness of his cause. The remaining gunmen, panicking, broke cover and tried to run for a better position. Calder tracked his movement and fired again. The man cried out, clutching his leg, and fell into the dust, his pistol skittering away from him. Boone Blackwood's voice was a furious snarl from behind a cluster of boulders. "I know you're out there! That girl is mine! You have no right!" Calder didn't answer. Words were useless now. He watched, waited. The wounded man was groaning, trying to crawl back to his weapon. Blackwood, however, was smarter. He was no longer firing wildly. He was trying to pinpoint Calder's position. It was in that tense, waiting silence that Marla arrived. She had been running, her lungs burning, the heavy rifle in agony in her arms. The sound of the first gunshot had frozen her in her tracks. a jolt of pure terror. But the sound of the following shots had spurred her on, a desperate, frantic need to see, to know. She came up on the scene from the east, behind Calder's position, and crawled the last 50 yards on her belly, her dress tearing on the sharp rocks. From her vantage point, she could see the whole terrible tableau. The 2 fallen men, the horses, panicked and riderless, and she could see Calder, a dark, still shape nestled in the rocks. The long barrel of his rifle pointed toward the trail. Then she saw the flicker of movement from the other side. Blackwood. He was creeping, low to the ground, trying to flank Calder's position, to come at him from the side. Calder was focused on the wounded man in the open and hadn't seen him. Marla's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but the sound was trapped in her throat. Blackwood was moving stealthily, his pistol drawn. He was going to get a clear shot in a matter of seconds. At that same moment, the wounded man on the ground, seeing his boss making a move, decided to create a diversion. He let out a loud, pained yell and fired his pistol in the air. The sound startled Calder, drawing his attention for the split second Blackwood needed. As Calder turned his head, Blackwood rose from behind a juniper bush, his own pistol leveled. He fired. The bullet struck Calder high in the chest, spinning him around with its force. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and fell back, the Winchester clattering against the rocks. Marla saw it happen, saw him fall, and something inside her snapped. The terror did not vanish, but it was consumed by a white-hot, singular purpose. There was no thought. There was only the rifle in her hands. She pushed herself up, her movements clumsy but quick. She rested the heavy barrel of the gun on a low, flat rock to steady it. Her hands were shaking so violently the sights were a blur. Her breath was coming in ragged, painful sobs. She could feel the tremors running through her entire body, but as she squinted down the barrel, she forced her eyes to focus. Through the haze of her own panic, she saw Blackwood standing over Calder's position, his pistol smoking, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face as he prepared to fire again, to finish it. Her hands shook, but her eyes, her gaze, were as steady and unwavering as Calder's had ever been. She did not blink. She pulled the trigger. The recoil was a brutal, physical blow, slamming the stock into her shoulder and knocking her backward into the dust. The report of the rifle was deafeningly close. She scrambled back up, her ears ringing, her shoulders screaming in protest. She looked across the arroyo. Silas Blackwood was on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his fancy vest. He was not moving. Silence fell. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the nervous stamping of the horses. The air was thick with the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder. For a moment, no one moved. Then, she saw Calder stir. He pushed himself up slowly, painfully. His left hand pressed tight against his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. He retrieved his rifle, stood on unsteady feet, and dealt with the last wounded man with a cold, final efficiency that made her flinch. It was over. Marla got to her feet, the old hunting rifle dropping from her nerveless fingers. She stumbled down the rise, through the sagebrush and rocks, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She reached the dusty trail where he stood, a grim, solitary victor in a battlefield of his own making. He was swaying slightly, his face pale as ash in the twilight, his breathing shallow and ragged. They stood there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet carnage, the red dust settling around their feet like a bloody mist. She looked at the blood on his shirt, at the deep, ragged pain in his eyes, and a wave of desolation washed over her. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. He looked at her, and even through the haze of his own agony, she saw that same fierce, protective fire in his eyes. He managed a grim, painful half-smile. "Not yet," he rasped, his voice strained. "Not when you still haven't said my name." His words hung in the ringing silence, a lifeline thrown to her across a chasm of pain. But the strength that had fueled them was fading fast. The grim half-smile dissolved, and his face went slack, his eyes clouding over with a gray film of agony. He swayed on his feet, and if Marla hadn't lunged forward to catch him, he would have collapsed into the bloody dust. The weight of him was immense, a dead, boneless weight that nearly drove her to her knees. All the strength and power she had witnessed in him was gone, replaced by a terrifying fragility. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to reclaim her, but she forced it down. The time for fear was over. Now was the time for action. Getting him onto his horse was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, his consciousness fading in and out. She half dragged, half carried him to the big roan, which stood trembling nearby, its eyes wide and wild from the smell of gunpowder and blood. She spoke to the horse in a low, soothing voice, mimicking the sounds she had heard Calder use, her hands stroking its neck until it quieted. With a strength born of pure, desperate adrenaline, she managed to haul him up, draping him over the saddle like a sack of grain. He groaned, a low, wretched sound that tore at her heart. The journey back to the homestead was the longest 2 miles of her life. She took the reins and led the horse, walking beside Calder, one hand steadying his body to keep him from sliding off. Darkness fell quickly, a thick, starless blanket that swallowed the trail. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of terror through her. The bodies of the men they had left behind were a silent, ghastly presence at her back, but she did not look back. She focused on the slow, plodding steps of the horse, on the feel of the leather reins in her hand, and on the ragged, shallow sound of Calder's breathing. He was her kin, and she was bringing him home. It was nearly midnight when they stumbled into the yard. The cabin, dark and silent, looked like a tomb. She slid the bar from the door and somehow, through sheer force of will, managed to get him inside and onto his bed. He collapsed onto the mattress with a heavy sigh, his eyes closed, his face unnaturally pale in the dim lantern light she managed to kindle. Now, the true terror began. The front of his shirt was a sodden, dark mass of blood. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had to see the wound, had to clean it. She had to deal with the bullet. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the pair of scissors she found in his supply chest. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she began to cut away the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt. The wound was a small, dark, angry hole high on the left side of his chest, just below the collarbone. It wasn't bleeding heavily now, but the flesh around it was already beginning to swell and discolor. The sight of it, of his flesh torn open, made her stomach heave. For a moment, she thought she was going to be sick. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind flashing back to another man's anger, to her own bruises, her own pain. But this was different. This was Calder. This wound had been meant for her, and he had stepped in front of it. She would not fail him. She worked for the next hour in a kind of waking trance. She built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering, and she kept a kettle of water boiling constantly. She washed her hands until they were raw, scrubbing them with the harsh lye soap. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat for bandages, and she prepared for the worst part. She took a long, thin-bladed skinning knife from his wall and held the tip in the fire until it glowed a cherry red. The smell of burning metal filled the small room. When it cooled, she took a long swallow from a bottle of whiskey she found in his chest, not for herself, but to pour a little over the wound, an act she'd read about in a tattered almanac. He cried out in his unconsciousness, a raw, animal sound, and she had to bite down on her own lip to keep from crying out with him. Then, with the lantern pulled close, her hands slick with his blood, she began to probe for the bullet. It was a ghastly, intimate violation. Every slight movement of the blade, every touch, felt like a fresh act of violence. She whispered to him as she worked, a stream of soothing, nonsensical words. "It's all right. Just a little longer. I'm here. It's all right." She didn't know if he could hear her, but the words were as much for her as for him. They were an anchor in a sea of blood and fear. After what felt like an eternity, she felt the tip of the knife grate against something hard and metallic. With a final, desperate prayer, she managed to work the flattened piece of lead free. It dropped into a tin bowl with a small, sickening clatter. The ordeal was over. She cleaned the wound one last time and packed it with a poultice of herbs she found hanging from the rafters' yarrow. He had called it once. Good for stopping bleeding. She bandaged his chest tightly with the clean strips of linen. Her work was done. She collapsed into the chair beside his bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. But as the hours of the night wore on, a new and more insidious enemy crept into the room, a fever. It started as a slight tremor that ran through his body. Then his skin, which had been cool and clammy, grew hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat. He began to toss his head back and forth on the pillow, his brow furrowed in some unseen struggle. He muttered, his voice thick and slurred, his words a jumbled, broken litany of names and places. "Pa, the fence line. Need more rain." Marla sat through it all, a silent, sleepless sentinel. This was a battle she could not fight for him with a knife or a bandage. This was a war being waged deep inside his own body. All she could do was bear witness. She dipped a cloth in cool water and bathed his forehead, his neck, his chest. She tried to trickle water between his cracked lips. He was in another world, a nightmare landscape of memory and pain. He called out for his brother, a name Ethan that was torn from him on a ragged cry. He wrestled with invisible enemies, his hands clenching and unclenching on the blanket. She watched him, and her heart ached with a pain far sharper than any she had ever known for herself. In his delirium, he was stripped of his stoic silence, his formidable strength. She saw the boy he had been, the man he was, and all the loss and hardship that had been carved into his soul. She saw the deep, lonely well of his grief, a grief he had always kept hidden behind his cold, steady eyes. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour before the dawn, when the fever was at its worst, he fell into a terrifying stillness. His tossing ceased. His muttering faded into a shallow, ragged whisper. His skin was on fire. He was losing. The fever was winning. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after he had named her his kin. He was the one solid thing in her entire, broken world. Without him, the silence would not be peaceful. It would be the empty, desolate silence she had known after her father died. An abyss. She leaned over him, her own face slick with sweat and tears. She took his hand. It was limp and burning hot in hers. His life felt like it was flickering, a candle flame guttering in a draft. She thought of his last words to her. "Out on that dusty, bloody trail. Not when you still haven't said my name." It had been a lifeline then, and it was a lifeline now. It was the only thing she had left to offer him. She brought his hand to her cheek, holding it there, trying to will her own life, her own strength, into him. She lowered her head until her lips were right beside his ear, so close she could feel the faint, hot puff of his breath. All the love, all the fear, all the desperate, unspoken gratitude she felt for this man coalesced into a single, perfect sound. A word she had held in her heart but had been too afraid to speak. A name that meant safety and home and hope. She whispered it, her voice a fragile, trembling thread in the vast, consuming silence of the sick room. Calder. The single word was a prayer, a plea, a summons. It hung in the hot, still air, a sound of impossible power and intimacy. For a moment, nothing happened. The shallow, ragged breathing continued. His body remained unnervingly still. A wave of despair washed over her. She was too late. But then the shallow breathing hitched. It stopped. And then it started again. A single, deep, shuddering intake of air. The hand in hers, which had been so limp, twitched. His fingers tightened, ever so slightly, around hers. And under the thin, translucent skin of his eyelids, his eyes moved. Slowly, as if they were impossibly heavy, his eyelids fluttered open. The fever-bright, unfocused glaze was gone. His eyes were clear. The pale, winter sky blue of them was calm and lucid. They were free of the nightmare. He looked at her. It was a look that held no pain, no confusion. It was the look of a man coming home after a long and brutal journey. It was the first clean light of dawn after a terrible, storm-racked night. It was the first thaw of spring after a long, hard, lonely winter. He saw her, truly saw her, and in his gaze, she finally saw herself reflected. Not as a broken thing to be pitied, but as the one who had called him back from the edge. The morning after the fever broke was as quiet as all the others, but the silence was different. It was no longer the heavy, anxious quiet of a vigil, but a light, hopeful stillness. Calder's eyes, clear and lucid, followed Marla as she moved about the cabin. He was terribly weak, the fever having burned away what little strength the bullet had left him. But he was present. He was back. The weeks that followed were a slow, laborious climb back to life. Marla became his nurse, his hands, his strength. She changed his bandages, spoon-fed him broth, and helped him take his first few unsteady steps from the bed to the porch. A new dynamic settled between them. He, who had always been the unshakable protector, was now completely dependent on her care. And she, who had always been the fragile one, discovered a deep, unwavering well of strength within herself. She did not falter. She tended to him with a fierce, gentle competence, her quiet presence a constant reassurance. There was no awkwardness in their new intimacy. When she helped him wash or change his shirt, there was no room for the shy blushing of before. Her touch was practical, necessary, and born of a profound, unspoken tenderness. He accepted her care with a quiet gravity, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude his tongue could not. In the crucible of his recovery, they were forged into something new. They were no longer a man and the woman he had rescued. They were two halves of a single, resilient whole. When he was strong enough to stand on his own for more than a few minutes, he undertook a grim, necessary task. He took a shovel and walked the 2 miles to the cottonwood grove. Marla watched him go from the cabin door, her heart heavy. He was gone for hours. When he returned, his face was set in hard, grim lines. But a great and terrible weight had been lifted from the homestead. He was burying the past, making the ground safe for their future. He never spoke of what he had done, and she never asked. Life began to find its rhythm again, but it was a new rhythm, a harmony for 3. The introduction of Jedediah, or Jed, happened as quietly and unexpectedly as everything else in their lives. Calder, finally well enough for the day-long ride, had gone to Prairie Ridge to pick up the wagon wheel he'd left behind weeks before and to restock their dwindling supplies. He returned late the next day, not alone. Sitting on the wagon seat beside him was a small, silent boy of about 7 or 8, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and eyes that were too big and too old for his face. The boy clutched a pathetic, lumpy bundle to his chest and stared at Marla with the wide, terrified gaze of a trapped rabbit. Calder lifted him down from the wagon and simply said, by way of explanation, "This is Jed. His folks passed from the fever. He'll be staying." And that was that. There was no discussion, no debate. Calder had seen a need, a small life adrift, and had simply gathered it in. Marla looked at the boy, at his ragged clothes and the stark fear in his eyes, and she saw a perfect, heartbreaking reflection of herself on the day she had collapsed in the dust. Her heart, which she had thought was finally whole, broke open again, but this time it broke with a rush of fierce, protective love. She knelt so she was at his level. "Hello, Jed," she said, her voice soft. "I'm Marla. You must be hungry." Jed didn't speak. He only stared, clutching his bundle tighter. But he allowed her to lead him into the cabin, and he ate the bowl of stew she gave him, his eyes darting around the room, taking everything in. He was a silent, watchful little ghost. That night, she made him a soft bed in the loft where she had once slept, and she and Calder began sleeping on a new, wider mattress he had built for them on the main floor, a silent acknowledgement of their new reality. The homestead, which had been a sanctuary for two, now became a home for three. Jed's presence changed the very air. He was a quiet child, made so by loss, and his silence fit with theirs. But his youth brought a new, gentle energy to the place. Marla found her purpose expanding. She was no longer just tending to a man. She was nurturing a child. She resurrected her garden with a new vigor. Where she had once planted for sustenance, she now planted for joy. She let Jed help her, showing him how to push the small seeds into the dark, rich earth. His small, dirt-caked fingers were clumsy at first, but he was a solemn and dedicated student. For the first week, he did not utter a single word. Then, one afternoon, as a tiny green shoot poked through the soil, he pointed a finger and whispered, "Look." It was the first word he had spoken. Marla's heart swelled. She began to teach him his letters, just as her father had taught her. She took a stick and drew a large looping in the dust of the yard. "That's A," she said. Jed watched, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then he took the stick and copied the letter, his own version small and shaky beside hers. They spent an hour every afternoon like this, the woman and the boy, scratching the secrets of the world into the dirt. Calder would often watch them from the barn, his arms leaning on the top rail of the corral. He never joined in, never spoke, but a soft, quiet look would come over his hard face, a look of profound and settled peace. Their life was a tapestry woven from small, unspoken vows. Love was not a word they used. It was the way she mended a tear in his favorite shirt before he even noticed it was ripped. It was the way he repaired the handle on the water bucket, sanding the wood smooth so it wouldn't give her splinters. It was the way they both watched over Jed, a silent, unified front of protection and care. Staying was not a promise they made. It was in the planting of a garden that would not be harvested until the fall. It was in the stacking of firewood for a winter that was still months away. It was in the simple, profound fact of waking up in the same home, day after day, without fear. One morning, Calder announced he was riding to Prairie Ridge again. He needed to trade for salt and flour. He was gone for 2 days. Jed was restless without him, his quiet gaze often drifting to the trail where Calder had disappeared. Marla felt his absence too, a hollow space in the fabric of the day. He returned late on the second day, the wagon loaded with sacks and barrels. He and Marla and Jed worked together to unload the supplies, moving in their familiar, efficient silence. There was a large, paper-wrapped parcel among the sacks. Calder set it just inside the cabin door and then immediately went to the barn to tend to the horses, as was his way. He never lingered after a transaction. Marla, her curiosity piqued, went to the parcel. Her name was not on it. Nothing was. She knelt and carefully untied the twine. The brown paper crackled as she unfolded it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a pair of boots. They were not fancy. They were made of a soft but sturdy brown leather, with practical, low heels and strong laces. They were built for walking, for working, for living a life on the hard, unforgiving earth. But to Marla, they were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She had been making do with a pair of Calder's old moccasins, which were too big and worn thin. She had never owned a proper pair of shoes in her life. With a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the leather. It was smooth and smelled rich and new. Hesitantly, she untied the laces and slipped her right foot into one. It slid in perfectly, snugly, as if the boot had been made just for her. She put on the other one. It was a perfect fit. She stood up. The solid feel of the soles on the wooden floor was a revelation. For the first time, she felt truly grounded, truly anchored to this place. She wiggled her toes inside the dark, comfortable space. How could he have known her size? She had never told him. And then she imagined him, sometime in the past few weeks, quietly noticing the size of her footprints in the dust of the garden, making a mental note, a silent observation that he had stored away. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet thoughtfulness that it took her breath away. The barn door had been a promise of safety. The boots were a promise of a future. They were a gift that said, "You are staying. You have a path to walk here, with me, and I will make sure you are well shod for the journey." She walked to the open cabin door and looked out at the barn, where she could hear the soft sounds of him working. The boots felt solid and right on her feet. She did not need to go to him and thank him. She did not need him to come to her and ask if she liked them. The gift, like everything else between them, was a statement that needed no words. It was another vow, another brick laid in the foundation of the quiet, fearless life they were building together. The boots became a part of her. They were the first thing she put on in the cool, pre-dawn darkness, and the last thing she took off before climbing into the bed she now shared with Calder. They were not just leather and laces. They were an anchor, a tangible connection to the earth of the homestead. When she wore them, she felt his quiet, constant presence, as if his thoughtfulness had soaked into the very soles. She walked differently in them, her stride more confident, her back a little straighter. The boots did not make a sound on the dusty ground, but in the landscape of her heart, they were a declaration. The season turned, bleeding from the harsh, baked heat of summer into the golden, gentle melancholy of autumn. The air grew crisp in the mornings, and the sun slanted low, bathing the plains in a soft, forgiving light. The homestead thrived under their combined care. Marla's garden, which had been a desperate scratch in the dirt, was now a riot of life, heavy with squash and beans. Calder's fences were strong. His barn was secure, and his horses were calm and well-tended. And Jed, the silent little ghost, was slowly, tentatively, coming back to life. He had started to talk, not in sentences, but in single, precious words. Water, he would whisper, pointing to the wilting squash leaves. Horse, he would say, his small hand stroking the roan's soft nose. More, he would murmur, pushing his empty stew bowl forward at dinner. Each word was a victory, a small flag planted in the territory of his grief. His greatest transformation happened in the dust of the yard, where Marla continued her patient lessons. She had moved beyond simple letters. One afternoon, she drew 3 letters in a row, J-E-D. "This," she said, her voice soft, "is you. This is your name, Jed." He stared at the shapes for a long time, his brow furrowed. He took the stick from her and carefully, painstakingly, copied the letters beside hers. His were wobbly and uncertain, but they were there. He looked at them, then looked at her, and a strange, wondrous light dawned in his 2 old eyes. He pointed to the letters. "Jed," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. He had not just learned a word, he had found himself, from a distance, leaning against the corral. Calder watched. He saw the boy's discovery, the way his shoulders straightened, the way a small, hesitant smile touched his lips for the very first time. He saw the answering warmth on Marla's face, a gentle, maternal glow that made her more beautiful than any sunset. He saw the 2 of them, the woman and the boy, a small, perfect picture of hope drawn in the dust, and the knot of old grief and solitude that he had carried in his chest for years. A knot he had thought was a permanent part of him, loosened just a little more. Their days were a quiet, seamless dance. There were no orders given, no requests made. They simply moved together, anticipating each other's needs. If he was reshoeing the horse, she would appear with a dipper of cool water. If she was struggling to carry a heavy basket of squash from the garden, his hands would be there to take it from her. They were a family, forged not by blood or by law, but by shared hardship and a profound, unspoken covenant of care. The word love was a foreign country they had never visited, a language they did not speak, but its meaning was present in every corner of their lives, in the neatly patched elbow of a shirt, in a garden cleared of stones, in a third bowl set at the simple wooden table. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep, bruised purple, the day's work was done. A gentle, cool breeze whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the dry, sweet scent of autumn. Jed, worn out from a day of helping Calder mend a harness, had fallen asleep almost as soon as he'd finished his dinner. Marla had carried his small, limp body up to the loft and tucked him into his bed, a fierce tenderness swelling in her heart. She came back down to find Calder standing by the open cabin door, looking out at the fading light. He was not wearing a shirt, and in the dim, warm glow from the lantern, she could see the landscape of his back. The long, angry scrape from his fall was now a faded, silvery scar, a pale line that joined the others. The wound in his chest, too, was healing, a puckered mark over a heart she was only just beginning to understand. He turned as he heard her approach, and his eyes met hers. He didn't speak, but he stepped aside, a silent invitation for her to join him. They walked to the small wooden porch and sat down on the top step, their shoulders not quite touching. For a long time, they were silent, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the sky in a soft, violet afterglow. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the gentle sigh of the wind and the distant, lonely call of a coyote. This was peace. This was a day without fear. A day where the past was a ghost that no longer had the power to haunt, and the future was a path that stretched out before them, clear and open. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the dust, the fear, the pain. It all felt like a story that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. The girl who had collapsed by the side of the road was gone. In her place sat a woman who knew the weight of a rifle, the feel of the earth, and the geography of a good man's heart. Slowly, tentatively, she leaned sideways until her head came to rest on his shoulder. He stiffened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in the stillness of his body. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed, accepting her weight, letting her settle against him. His shoulder was hard and warm through the rough fabric of his trousers. It felt solid, immovable. It felt like home. She closed her eyes, breathing in the clean, familiar scent of him, of soap and leather and wood smoke. A comfortable, profound silence settled between them. It was a silence filled with everything they didn't need to say. The stars began to appear, pricking the deep, dark velvet of the sky one by one. The air grew cooler, and she shifted slightly, nestling closer into his warmth. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, moved, her fingers tracing the worn denim of his thigh before finding his hand, which lay, open and relaxed, on the step beside him. She slipped her fingers between his. His hand was large and rough, the palm calloused from years of hard labor. It was the first hand that had ever been offered to her in kindness, the hand that had pulled her from the dust. It was the hand that had built a door to keep her safe. It was the hand she had held through a long, fevered night. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, gentle pressure that was both a comfort and a promise. She felt a swell of emotion so powerful it was like a tide rising within her. It was a feeling so vast, so pure, that it demanded a name. She thought of the first time she had whispered his name, in the darkness of the sick room. a desperate plea to bring him back from the edge. This was not that. This was not a cry born of fear or of pain. This was something else entirely. She turned her head slightly, her lips close to the warm skin of his neck. She breathed his name, not as a summons, not as a question, but as a final, quiet declaration, a statement of fact, an answer to a question she hadn't even known she was asking. Calder. The name was a soft, warm breath in the cool night air. It was not for the wound in his chest. It was for the healing in her soul. It was for the boy sleeping peacefully in the loft. It was for the boots by the door, the garden in the yard, and the quiet, fearless life they had built together. It was the purest, simplest word for love. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply turned his head and inclined it, a slow, graceful movement in the starlight. He lowered his forehead until it rested against hers, skin against skin. His brow was cool, his presence immense. They stayed like that. Two solitary figures joined as one, their breaths mingling in the space between them. No one smiled. There was no need. The search was over. They had been two broken, lonely halves, wandering a vast and unforgiving wilderness. And here, on the steps of a small, dusty cabin under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, they had finally found the only thing that had ever been missing each other. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.